on the kid side and on the family side, parent side, and that is the subject of launching. And what I first want us to talk about is we hear all over the news and in the media, failure to launch. So let's tease that out a little bit. When is that term even appropriate, even today?
Yeah, it's a great question, because to me, the term failure to launch has a very negative connotation and a very judgmental feeling to it. And I think what people are referring to are really adults, young adults, between the ages of 18 to even 30, let's say, who haven't met the normal or typical stages of development that one used to see for an 18 to 30-year-old. And what would that be? That would be graduation. It would be moving out of the home and getting your own apartment and becoming financially independent. It would be getting married, having children, all of those things. And those things used to be very stereotypical expectations in terms of the developmental milestones of an adult. I'm not sure we can use that barometer anymore, given our circumstances in our society. I think we have to ease up a little bit on the rate at which we expect our young adults to develop and to emerge. So let's just talk about that for a little bit.
Yeah, the term emerging adult, we're hearing that much more now, because it used to be that when adolescents hit 18, we had this expectation that they would become adults. Whether they made those milestones or not, we had an expectation of adulthood post 18. And that was when I was growing up, or it was when my parents were growing up, but it has faded as an expectation. And that is becoming later and later and later. We're living longer. We have longer periods of adulthood. It makes sense evolutionarily that there would be an intermediate step now between adolescence and full-blown adulthood. And that's what we're calling emerging adult. But what I would love to hear from you, Myrna, is what ages are you seeing people in that emerging adult, and what are sort of the tasks of emerging adulthood, so we don't start confusing them with failing to launch?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think that I would rather describe emerging adulthood, rather than in milestones, more in characterological traits. Do you have persistence? Do you have frustration tolerance? Do you have motivation? Let me think, what else? Frustration tolerance, resistance, motivation, persistence, resiliency. I think all of those things go into an adult who is beginning to emerge. Problem solving, taking responsibility and accountability. Now, keep in mind that we are testing this generation. Just society in general is testing this generation. We've got, aside from a global pandemic, we've got economic pressures and academic pressures that kids face today that I don't think I faced when I was growing up. Healthcare. How many people are just taking a job just so they can get healthcare and support themselves? The climate change and how that's impacting our young people. Racial injustice. I mean, there are so many challenges that come from external sources. Forget about their own internal adaptation. They have to be able to adapt to the society that they are surrounded by and the culture they're surrounded by. And those are healthy adults who have those traits may or may not be able to successfully adapt. And I don't think that there's as big a problem with adults, parents, giving their kids some time, a soft landing with which to develop, as long as they're recognizing the other issues that may come into play when young adults are not demonstrating those character traits.
Right. So when in fact the red flags are down, they don't have resiliency, they don't have the ability to delay gratification, they don't have coping strategies. When we're seeing that coming into 20s and mid 20s and late 20s, then we're looking at some issues. And I wouldn't necessarily call it what you said in that beautiful way, that it's too stigmatizing and judgmental, instead of calling it failure to launch, because it sounds like it's a fait accompli without any possibility of change. Failing, let's make it an active sort of, process. Okay, so they're failing now. What are they need in place to be able to ameliorate that situation, right?
I actually love that. I mean, failure to launch gets a bigger audience.
Right.
But failing to launch means it's an active process. It's not a fait accompli. It's an active process. And what are some things that professionals, that parents, educators, clinicians can do to help these kids who are quote unquote failing to launch, help them grow? I think that's really, a key question. What can we do?
So I can see a couple of things. One is we have to start talking. We have to start saying, not just setting expectations with our kids or talking in that way, but really, why are you experiencing this sort of malaise? What are the issues? We have to get our heads out of the sand and potentially look at mental health, behavioral health, and familial issues before we're going to be able to see much progress in those characteristics.
How early do you think it is important for families, parents, let's say, to begin to recognize those issues and see them as problematic?
Younger than at launching. I think we see, I think it is Gail Saltz from the Child Mind Institute. She talks about the concept of praise, and that we are better off praising that thing that requires overcoming a hurdle and hardship and grit than we are praising that thing somebody does well and easily. So if we start with our kids really there, then we are preparing them with those tools potentially to launch. If we start in our 20s with, okay, I know I've done everything for you. I know I wrote your college essay. I know I did, your laundry and all of these things. But now, frankly, it's time for you to do it. You're 24 years old and it's time for you to do it. And while it may be time, where was the runway? And I think we have to really look at that.
So really, developmentally, starting at as young an age as possible to teach kids problem solving and to teach them that they can do it. One of my favorite phrases when my kids were growing up, sometimes I got away with it and sometimes I didn't, was figure it out. You'll figure it out. And whenever I said that, the eyes rolled, but they knew I was leaving them to figure it out. And they also knew that I believed that
in them. You trusted them, you believed in them. And even if they didn't do it perfectly, you understood they had the capacity to deal with the consequence necessarily, right? Mm-hmm. You had faith in them.
Yeah. I also think that as parents, one of the ways that we can help our children, our adolescents, our young adults move forward is to tolerate, we need to be able to tolerate their discomfort so that they can tolerate some discomfort. I do believe, and I guess that's the theory of another pejorative term, a helicopter parent, a snowplow parent, but I do believe that there is some truth to the fact that my generation, our generation, wanted things to be easy for our kids. We wanted things to be, and we wanted them to be successful as we measure it in our own eyes.
Right. I think that's right.
Right.
Moving from that, I want to talk just a second about how hard it may be for us to witness our kids struggle and allow them the responses they have without leaping in, as you're saying. And when I think about that, I think about back in graduate school when we were discussing Winnicott, who was a pediatrician and a psychoanalyst in Europe following World War II, and he came up with the concept of good enough mothering. And a good enough mother allows her kids to be frustrated and angry with her, thereby allowing them to learn reality of the world.
Yeah. I'm, you know, parenting has been I mean, I am a parent, but now I'm also a grandparent. And I get to watch, like this morning, I was doing a puzzle with my 2-year-old grandson, and he couldn't put that piece in the hole. He just couldn't get it right. And he just kept saying, help, help, help. And it would have been really much easier for me to help him do it than to say, figure it out. But I let him throw his fit because I learned from my own kids that if I didn't do that, he never was going to figure it out on his own. Right. That I had to have a little bit more of a laissez-faire attitude towards my quote unquote parenting, for sure. But it is hard. I mean, let's even talk about money. Let's talk about giving kids money.
Yeah.
They have no way of earning a living right now. These 18, you did a research thing on that. Do you remember how many 18 to 30-year-olds are living at home right now?
According to Zillow, 2.9 million adults moved in with a parent during March, April, and May.
Yep, I got that. And you also told me by 2018, 25 million young adults in that age range were living at home. And that was a Pew analysis, right?
Yeah.
So if they're living at home right now, it could be for great reasons. I mean, they could have moved home to save money, to be able to pay off their student debt. But now the kids who have moved in, they've moved in maybe because they've lost their jobs. They've moved in because, they couldn't pay their rent. So how do parents not care? How do they care for their kids without caretaking? How do they care without caretaking?
That is a great question. And the first sentence I teach every parent I work with is, wow, that must be really difficult. Because we need to be able to express empathy for the fact that they're struggling without making it their fault. Well, why haven't you filled out another resume? Starting with, wow, that must be really difficult. Start the conversation.
So make them, even though, let's say, the job prospects are difficult out there right now, what you're saying is
validate.
Let them know they have to struggle for it.
Yes.
Let them know that they have to struggle.
That they will stretch, and that maybe we hadn't taught them how to stretch, but this time will teach them, and that they will be better people with more grit, with more resilience at the end of this than they were before, if they just put one foot in front of the other.
The other thing that crosses my mind when I work with families, one of the things that I tell them is it really is actually really a very positive thing for kids to struggle, for kids to be uncomfortable and struggle through problems. parents need to step in when kids are suffering. And we need to understand the difference. And that's the difference between failing to launch and emerging to launch. If you're emerging, you're struggling. If you're failing, you're probably suffering. And so, we know that because no matter what we do, they have a million ways to avoid and distract. They can avoid and distract by isolating themselves in their rooms. They can isolate on the internet. Substance abuse is rising because they can get comfort from abusing substances. So when parents come to you and families come to you and they say to you, my kid is suffering right now, what then?
So the first thing I ask is, number one, how are you handling their suffering? Because if we think of family systems as a set of interconnected gears, the response of the person who is hearing the suffering can contribute or be helpful. So I start with the person who is not suffering and ask, how are you responding?
Okay.
Because we may be able to make a shift there.
Right. And I do agree with that. I do think that that's when our caretaking locks into place, when we see our kids suffering. So instead, if we're a little less emotional about it, a little less enmeshed with it, then perhaps we could see them more as capable and expect them to be more capable by setting pretty good expectations and boundaries.
Yes.
I think that would be the very first step. I think a lot of parents, when they see their kids suffering, they're afraid to do that.
Okay.
And I think they're afraid to do that because their kids do hold them emotionally hostage.
Well, and we've set up the scenario. 50 years ago, it was incumbent upon us to prove our worth to our parents. That has flipped 100%. We are now hustling for worth from our kids.
Absolutely. That is absolutely true.
So the power is in the hands of the person who is not healthiest in that moment.
Yes.
And what we are doing as professionals is wresting that away from them so that we can be helpful.
Yes. So in kids, and I'm just going to call them kids, but in kids who are failing to launch, there is an imbalance of power often that we see in a family dynamic.
That's right. That's right. 100%.
Right. And I would also say that it is important for parents to not just set the boundaries and expectations, but again, going back to the idea of making them uncomfortable, cut off the parent ATM.
Yeah.
Cut off that parent ATM, because that may, in fact, get them to a place where they say, help. Can you help me help myself? Because with an adult, it's harder and harder to impose help on them. But if you can get them to ask for help because they're uncomfortable, well, then you've won a big battle, a big step, move forward.
Right. And one of the things I work with families on is accepting that pain is not necessarily bad for us. Pain can be our friend. Struggle can be our friend. And in that process, it's the thing that tells us to go to the dentist or the doctor or to change our behavior. I hate myself this morning after the way I talked last night. We need to allow people to experience that pain if they're going to change.
Right. Right.
So to your point, when they're experiencing some pain, and I'm not just talking about stub my toe pain, but the kind that you look in the mirror and say, this is not the life, I am not the person I wish to be. And those emerging adults who are failing to launch or not emerging are feeling that pain, I guarantee it. And if we allow them that, we then can be a resource to the solution.
Right. And I think that the O'Connor Group and my firm, Harris, Kramer, and Liston, I think there's a synergy between what we do, because I don't want families to who have kids who are in pain or families who are in pain as a first resort to look to, well, where can I send them? Who's going to fix them? How are they going to get better? Although I do have some pretty good ideas about that. But first, you need to work through a process yourself where you realize how you are contributing to the dysfunction of your child. And maybe then there'll be a different style of communication in the home.
I totally agree with that. And if we can approach anybody, but particularly somebody struggling with young adult issues, with compassion, empathy, and actual truth, I think sometimes we avoid the truth when we're trying to be nice. If we can truth, we have a possibility of engaging with them so that they can hear us.
Yeah. And very often, one of my favorite things is when you do go through that process and the young adult does say, I need help. Sometimes help is outside of the home. Sometimes they do need to have an environment that allows them to struggle, allows them to skin their knees, but there's a safety net underneath them. But that safety net is not that enmeshment. It's not personal. It's natural and logical consequences, which as parents, it's hard. It's hard to enforce that, especially if you don't see a safety net there and you see kids in pain and suffering.
Yeah. And refusing supports. They're in pain, suffering, and they refuse to accept the help that they desperately need.
Right.
So, question for you. What is your favorite technique to get somebody, and this is just my picking your brain, to get somebody who's reluctant to talk?
Young adult?
Yes.
Well, I'm usually pretty honest and transparent. And I usually tell them who I am and what I do, which is I'm a therapeutic and educational consultant, and I spend my life in a car and a plane visiting programs all over this country for older adolescents and young adults who are having trouble getting out of their own way, who are just stuck. And that, the family dynamic, while there's love, it's not allowing you to grow. So your parents definitely sought me out. They were the first ones because they have concerns. I don't usually, I usually go to the young adult first after my initial conversation to ask you, what are your concerns? What are you concerned about? Or tell me what you think your parents are concerned about. So at least if they can't talk about their own concerns, at least they can articulate perhaps, well, my mom's concerned because I play too many video games, or my dad is concerned because, I'm stealing his credit card.
Yes.
That
makes perfect sense. I love that. What are your parents concerned? You may not have a single concern, but what are they concerned about? That's a great technique.
Yeah.
My basic way of setting the stage with any young adult, frankly, is to put them in a car, drive.
Oh, nice.
Yes. If I can, I will get the young adult in a vehicle because there is something about being in movement that loosens the tongue. So that is my one little piece.
I like that.
Yeah. Car therapy. Even when I worked in a middle school, I had gotten special permission to take the kids off campus.
You couldn't do that now.
I know. It was a long time.
Here's the way society has changed. We also, I'm a hugger. So I like to hug my kids and my families. We couldn't do that in a public school right now at all. And that's a shame.
You can't do it anywhere right now.
I still do it. I can do it just because look at me. I mean, I'm a grandma. I can do it.
That's right. You can get away with it. That's right.
Get away with it. Exactly.
So I've got one more quote before we close.
Okay.
I think we're getting close to closing. And My quote is Desmond Tutu's quote, and I have it memorized because I have to repeat it to myself quite frequently. And that is something like pain and struggle are the anvil upon which our children's character is forged and where they learn empathy and compassion. And we can support them by knowing they will make it through that.
Oh, wow. I almost want to clap. That was,
I know. I love that one.
that was great. That was great.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Natalie, do we have any questions, or did we just...
Does anyone have any questions? And there's nothing in the chat, so certainly you can feel free to reach out to me directly. And also I will send everyone the link who was in attendance today so that they can have a copy of this once it gets edited, and you can definitely direct your client. Oh, hang on, someone wrote something.
Okay.
All right, from Aaron Marcus. More emerging young adults are ensconced at home now that they've been in college due to the pandemic. Family members are continuing to do all the heavy lifting, picking up the pieces when a young adult may have gone to college/started a job where a more accurate picture of their developmental abilities would have emerged. Thus, the treatment that may be needed is getting further put off. How can we all help parents to understand when it's time to get help and the level of care that is needed?
Well, my whole thing is basically somebody in the house is going to get miserable. And that's when that moment comes. The mother, the father, somebody is going to start raising the flag. We are allowing our kids to regress under our roof. And that's when that help usually comes in.
Or we are suffering. I mean, sometimes the parent has to take care of themselves and say, we need to do something very different. And it may well be an outside placement. It may well be that we need to emerge as parents while you emerge as an adult, but we can't do it under the same roof.
That's right. I like that. That's great.
Awesome. Anything more to add?
Marcus.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at our next discussion.
Thanks, Natalie.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.